just communicate to Muhammad, that God also communicated to Abraham, to Jesus, to Moses, to all of them. So this is the sense of confirmation.
Okay.
Now, in terms of, say, for example, the Bible that we have in our hands today, does that go along with the revelation that's given to Muhammad? So I suppose this is actually the question. So the Muslim response to this is essentially that what the confirmation is of the fact that God gave communication. So God giving communication is not the same thing as, first of all, if the text that we have today, from the biblical text, is it the same thing? Number one, and number two, is it even authoritative? And let me explain what I mean about number two first, or do you want to go?
No.
Let me continue.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me give this a particular example that in terms of the content of biblical content and in contrast to Quranic content.
Okay.
All right. So biblical content has Sabbath, right? That on the seventh day that God ceased in the creation in his creation. Now, I admit that generally Jewish commentators say that they kind of look at this in a sort of a metaphorical sense of God ceasing in the action of creation. But a number of Christian writers take it in a literal sense, whether it's literal or metaphorical. The point here is Sabbath is observed and is observed by rest. Is understood to be a day of rest because God, at least in the literal reading of it, that God rested. Now, as a result, there's a particular religious practice, the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Okay. Although the Bible has maybe at least one other reason, but we're focusing on this one reason. All right. So the Quran comes along, and first of all, the Quran says that first of all, God does not rest. لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. That God, first of all, it says God does not rest. So as a consequence, the ritual that comes from the idea of God resting, meaning the Sabbath ritual, that's not something Muslims observe.
Yeah.
Because the premise of it is, from the Islamic perspective, is not correct. So then what I'm trying to give you is an example of, because you're mentioning that the scripture, that the Bible, basically your argument is that the Bible is to be authoritative to Muslims on the basis of certain Quranic verses. And so I'm giving a practical example to show that it doesn't really work that way.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah,
then.
please.
Would it be contradictory, like if you understood it in a metaphorical way that God just ceased from his creation, not that he rested because he was tired? Would that necessarily go against Islamic?
Good question.
doctrine?
That's a good question. So from an Islamic perspective, we say, again, referencing the verse of the throne in chapter 2, verse 255, لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم, that God does not slumber, rest, nor sleep. So so even from a metaphorical perspective, we don't read it in that way.
Right.
And so and this is actually, and I've had this conversation with many people over the years, this kinds of language is among the issues that divide Muslims from Christians and Jews.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, from an Islamic perspective, it seems like we're going directly into this topic rather than but from an Islamic perspective, in chapter 27, verse 76 of the Quran, it says, indeed, this Quran does give clarity about the majority of issues that the children of Israel differ about. And I believe that the term children of Israel references both Jews and Christians, not just Jews.
Okay.
Okay.
Interesting.
And as a consequence, what I'm saying here, using this example of Sabbath, or the idea of God resting, let me go back to that, the idea of God resting, that even as a metaphor, Muslims don't use this even as a metaphor because it creates an image of God, of a weak God, basically.
Yeah, but I understand how if somebody can misunderstand that, it could lead to a bad view of God.
Yeah.
But if they understood it right in the correct way, that it's not that he's ceasing because he's tired, but he saw that it was good and he ceased from that type of creation.
The thing is that not everybody is at the same level.
That's true.
Cornel West. I mean, I often quote Cornel West. Cornel West says not everybody wakes up at the same time. Okay, so as a consequence, there has to be very clear language, especially on God concept. God concept is the most important issue in faith.
Okay.
Is God concept. So because of that, even as in a metaphorical sense, we're told not to use that type of language. That in this case that God slumbers or sleeps. Now, to directly go back to what you mentioned before. You mentioned before something about God ceasing in His activities.
Yeah.
Now, I have to really look and see, to be honest with you, which particular text. But there is a text that in the Quran that implies that God is always at work.
Really?
That there is a text. It's in chapter. And again, if you give me a moment, I can probably find it.
Yeah.
But the point of the text is that God is always working. So God is never. Let me ask you this. Let me do this analogy. Did you ever see a movie called Bruce Almighty?
Yeah.
You remember that movie?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you're a little younger than me. Maybe you don't know this movie, but there's a movie called Bruce Almighty.
Yep,
right?
yep.
And so the storyline of it is that God, played by Morgan Freeman, goes on vacation and he appoints, I forgot the other gentleman's name, to be his replacement.
Yeah, Jim Carrey.
Jim Carrey. Okay, he appoints Jim Carrey to fill in for him while he was on vacation. So from an Islamic perspective, that's not. From an Islamic perspective, God never goes on vacation.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay.
That's Christian perspective as well.
Okay.
There's actually, because we are getting to the God topic, but
Okay.
but this is still good.
Yeah.
So Jesus talks about how even on the Sabbath, because he's healing people and stuff like that, and they come at him and they're like, well, how are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And he says,
man is made for the Sabbath, and there's something. I mean, the Sabbath is made for man. Sorry.
That's another one. But in this particular one, it's in John 5. He says that my Father has been working till now, so I also am working, right? So it's not that we don't believe that God gets inactive, because if he did, then all of universe would collapse, right? He's sustaining the universe and all of creation. But just in that context, as far as like initial creation, he saw that it was good and rested or ceased from that particular action. Not that he stops working altogether.
I mean, I get what you're meaning. I get what you mean by that. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to convey is the Islamic perspective, because the Islamic perspective, how it presents God, it's very precise. It's very strong language, very precise, very strong fashion. And so what the Quran does, what Islam does, is that it makes sure, especially on God concept, is to present God in ways that in a way that should not be misunderstood in its most fundamental nature. Because if we understand God, because where does it stop? If God is on vacation, then where does it stop?
Yeah.
If God is on vacation, then again, who's running the
Yeah,
world? I mean, and going to the movie, going to the movie. I mean, there's some scenes that I'm remembering from the movie, which I don't know if it's appropriate to share,
right?
In this context. So where does it go? And even you find some ideas in mythology, especially Greek mythology, where if God exists, then of course the gods are at war, but also if God leaving. I mean, there have been some thinkers who have made that argument that God exists, even in the 19th century, that God exists, but then he left. He left. So the way that the Quran presents the issue of God concept is basically not to use that type of language that could be distorted like that at all.
Now, so now I understand now, right?
Yeah,
now, so here's my question, just for clarity on this.
Please.
Is it necessarily contradictory, right? Now, I understand staying away from this type of language to avoid misunderstanding, but is it necessarily contradictory, to say God doesn't sleep or slumber in the Quran versus God rested on the Sabbath day? Is that necessarily contradictory?
If you want to use the word "stopped" in the sense of this conversation, if you want to use the word "stopped," I mean, on a personal level, I don't have a problem with that. Okay. On a personal level, I don't have a problem with that. If you want to use the word "rest," then that implies a weakness and a contradiction, and thus a contradiction of the idea that God presented in the Quran, that God neither slumbers nor sleeps. So I hope I understand your question.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying, if I'm meaning it in the way of just stop, then sure. If I'm using the word rest, that can imply these.
It implies a weakness. It implies a weakness.
connotations.
It implies a weakness on God's part, and that's something that for Muslims that we don't go for. And again, part of this this conversation, again, the Quran says that indeed this Quran gives clarification on the majority of issues, and so this is perhaps issue number one.
Okay.
The issue of God concept.